They called her Sigrid of the North Shore, a name that survived not through legend of kindness or song, but through one night when she was forced to face a game no woman ever truly survived: the rope trial. The sagas never told this part loudly. They whispered it, because what happened in that torchlit hall was not justice. It was obedience wrapped in ritual, cruelty disguised as faith. The ocean wind cut through the timber like a knife, carrying with it the smell of salt, sweat, and something older: fear. The crowd gathered as if watching a feast, but their silence was hungrier than any hunger. What they came to see was not truth. It was surrender. Sigrid's only crime was loyalty. She had refused to betray the man who hid her brother after he was accused of stealing from the chieftain's shipyard. In that world, silence was guilt. Mercy was weakness. So they tied her wrists with wet hemp, rough as bark, and called it divine judgment. 2 poles, 2 ropes, 2 men pulling in opposite directions until the body confessed what the tongue would not. The gods, they said, demanded proof that truth could bleed. The crowd pressed closer as the torches hissed. The rope trial wasn't a test of truth. It was theater. A ritual of power meant to remind every woman in that hall who ruled her body, her breath, her silence. The trial master, an old man with eyes like wet stone, raised his hand. His voice echoed through the smoky air. The rope shall know her truth. The words were ancient, rehearsed, and heavy with superstition. The villagers bowed their heads as if the gods themselves were watching. But no gods were there. Only men who needed to believe their cruelty was holy. Sigrid stood barefoot on the cold wooden floor, her hair braided tightly into the rope fibers. Each strand was both a weapon and a prayer. She trembled but didn't weep. That refusal made them angrier. To defy pain was to question the order of things. The first pull came like thunder. Her arms strained, her shoulders screamed, but she didn't yield. The rope groaned, the beams creaked, and for a heartbeat, even the sea outside seemed to hold its breath. The hall smelled of damp wood and fear, a scent that would never leave its walls again. Each sound in the hall became a heartbeat: the groan of rope, the crack of wood, the whisper of breath. They called this justice, but it was never meant to find truth. It was meant to teach obedience. Every creak in the beams said the same thing: do not resist. The architecture itself was built for cruelty: narrow walls to trap the screams, low ceilings to make echoes seem endless. The firelight flickered against faces that pretended to be stone. Some looked away. Others watched with the still fascination of people convinced that suffering was sacred. And somewhere behind them a child watched, Sigrid's daughter, eyes wide, learning what silence costs. To the chieftain, this was more than a trial. It was a sermon. In the Viking world, loyalty to clan outweighed mercy, and women like Sigrid were the price of that belief. Her pain was their reminder, her endurance their entertainment. But the longer she stood unbroken, the more the crowd shifted. Murmurs rippled like a tide. The men pulling the ropes began to glance at one another. The chieftain's jaw tightened. If she endured too long, the lie might tear. The ropes screamed again, fibers tearing under strain. The men pulling them gritted their teeth, their muscles trembling, but still she stood. The crowd's murmurs grew uneasy. For every second Sigrid refused to break, something inside the ritual itself began to crack. The chieftain's eyes darkened. This wasn't how it was meant to go. The rope trial thrived on collapse, on surrender, not endurance. Her silence had turned into defiance, her pain into accusation. The hall, once united in spectacle, now felt divided. A few whispered, "The gods protect her." Others muttered, "No woman endures this without witchcraft." Sigrid's breath came in shudders, but her eyes never lowered. Each heartbeat was rebellion. Each moment of survival was a threat, because if she could outlast the rope, then everything they believed about order, about male power, about divine justice, began to tremble. The chieftain stepped forward, his voice cutting through the noise. "The rope breaks only when truth breaks with it," he roared, forcing the crowd's fear back into obedience. The spell was restored. The system survived. But in that single pause, in that single breath, something ancient had shifted. The rope trial didn't end that night. It became a tradition, a ritual dressed in holy words and wrapped in law. For generations, women were bound before crowds that called their pain sacred. Fidelity, loyalty, obedience, and all tested the same way, through suffering. Every trial began the same. every verdict already written. They called it purification, but it was nothing more than control. Each rope that tightened reaffirmed power, men over women, chiefs over clans, fear over reason. The cruelty was precise, organized, almost bureaucratic. Rules, witnesses, ceremonies, savagery disguised as civilization. Yet sometimes cracks appeared. A rope snapped too early. A woman endured too long. A husband begged for mercy. In those moments the ritual faltered and the truth beneath it flickered. That pain was never divine, only human. Historians later found fragments of rope in Viking graves, fibers darkened by age, stained with salt and blood. They labeled them ritual tools, never saying whose breath they once held. To name that truth would be to admit the oldest lie, that suffering can prove righteousness. The rope had never sought truth. It had only ever measured submission. Years passed, and yet the rope never left. It lived on in new halls, new villages, new excuses. Each generation called it something different, a truth game, a test of the gods, a sacred judgment. But no matter the name, the purpose was always the same, to remind the living who held the power to define truth. By the 11th century, Christian monks began writing about it in disgust. They described northern tribes who pulled truth from the hair of women, calling them savages. But the monks misunderstood. It wasn't barbarism. It was order, a ritual so precise it blurred the line between religion and bureaucracy. It had rules, witnesses, ranks, and even prayers. Cruelty didn't happen in chaos. It happened in structure, and structure was what made it last. It wasn't wild rage. It was systemic. Each rope trial reinforced the machinery of fear that kept people silent. The women who screamed were proof of control. The women who didn't scream were proof of guilt. Either way, the system won. The halls that held these trials were not ruins then. They were symbols of unity, of clan justice. Long beams carved with runes, the scent of smoke and seawater clinging to the timber, and within that sacred geometry, they made pain into language. Each pull of the rope was a verse, each cry an oath. But something else was happening too, something the chieftains never saw. In every hall, in every crowd, a few faces turned away. A few hearts recoiled. They didn't speak, but they remembered. And that quiet remembering, that silent resistance, why it began to rot the foundation of fear. Because cruelty, when repeated too long, begins to reveal itself. In 2017, when archaeologists uncovered rope fragments near Ribe in Denmark, grooves worn deep into twin wooden posts, they found human blood and traces of hair oil mixed with salt. Those fibers carried more than DNA, they carried confession. The earth had remembered what the sagas tried to forget. The truth was buried in silence, but the silence wasn't empty. It was full of pain, of endurance, of women who refused to vanish even when their names were erased. They were renamed the enduring, the tested, the unbroken. Words meant to hide individuality, to reduce them to roles. But bones remember. Wood remembers. Rope remembers. And when the rope finally snapped, it didn't sound like mercy. It sounded like thunder. When the rope broke, the hall went still. The sound didn't fade, and it hung in the air like a heartbeat that refused to die. The fibers tore with a deep, muffled crack, and for a moment no one breathed. Sigrid fell to her knees, her wrists raw and bleeding, the ropes limp around her arms like dead serpents. The chieftain stepped forward. His men looked to him, waiting for the command that would tell them what the gods had decided. But there were no gods in that silence, only human fear disguised as reverence. Sigrid had endured too long. Her body, her silence, her sheer refusal to collapse had turned the trial inside out. She had become what they feared most, a mirror. For the first time, the crowd wasn't sure who was guilty. Whispers rippled like a storm wind through the hall. She did not yield. She is blessed. She speaks the god's truth. The chieftain's face hardened. He couldn't allow this to spread. The idea that a woman's endurance meant divine favor. That would unravel everything. He lifted his voice above the murmurs. The rope breaks only when truth breaks with it. And with that, the lie reassembled itself. Fear turned into obedience again. The crowd bowed their heads, their doubt swallowed whole. The hall resumed its rhythm of cruelty. But history doesn't forget those moments. The moments where systems tremble. After Sigrid's trial, no new rites were held there. Livestock refused to cross the threshold. They said the hall stank of brine and blood, that even years later the beams dripped when rain fell. The villagers abandoned it, and yet the rope's logic did not die. It moved from hall to court, from faith to law, from ritual to rule. It learned to disguise itself in cleaner words. Obedience became discipline. Judgment became process. Every age builds its own rope. Sometimes it's visible, sometimes it's not. But it always pulls the same way, demanding endurance as proof, demanding silence as virtue. The smell of damp fear never really faded. It just changed its perfume. Centuries passed. The hall collapsed. The wood rotted, the ropes turned to dust, but the idea behind them never died. The rope trial wasn't just a Viking ritual. It was the blueprint of control. It taught the world a dangerous lesson, that pain could be proof, that suffering could equal truth, that silence meant guilt. And though time buried the rope, its shadow never left us. It changed shape. It learned new languages. In medieval Europe, they drowned women to test their innocence. In the 1600s, they called it witch trials. In the 1800s, they called it hysteria testing. Today, it hides in courtrooms, in offices, in whispers online. Systems that still demand women prove their pain to be believed. We've traded ropes for rhetoric, beams for laws, torches for screens. Yet the choreography of control remains the same. Humanity still gathers to watch, still judges endurance instead of innocence. The crowd hasn't vanished, and it's just scrolling. But somewhere in that endless noise, there's still a faint echo. The sound of a rope snapping. The reminder that cruelty never disappears, it adapts. And that endurance, true endurance, doesn't prove guilt. It exposes power. So when you remember Sigrid of the North Shore, don't think only of her suffering. Think of her silence that became rebellion. Think of her refusal to fall. She didn't survive to prove herself innocent. She survived to prove the system wrong. Because every cruelty is a pattern, and every pattern can be broken. This has been Dark History of Vikings. If her story moved you, like, comment, and share it, so her endurance echoes beyond the screen. And if you believe that truth should never bleed for proof, subscribe, because next time we'll unearth another ritual the world tried to bury, but couldn't.